Okay, everyone. All right, this week, this Shabbat, we have one of the most fascinating passages in the Torah reading. Parsha Ki Tisa begins with a command that when they're to take a census of the Jewish people, really a census of the men, and instead of counting each adult male over the age of 20 is supposed to give a half shekel, machzita shekel. And then when you add up all the half shekels, then you will have a census of all the men of mature men in the community. This is tied into the idea that we don't like to count people. Even till today, there's a hesitancy in religious Jewish circles from counting people. If you want to count a minyan, instead of counting the people, you might recite a verse that has 10 words in it. Hoshia tamecha vorechet nachatech reim v'nasem ad olam. So when you get to olam, you've got 10 people for the minyan. So that's at the beginning of it. But the real problem comes in is that Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't come down from Har Sinai. He's been up there for over 39 days. The exact count is a little confused, and people get confused because they're supposed to be there for 40 days and nights. And so when, according to their calculations, Moshe is slow in descending from the mountain, they become worried and they turn to Aaron, the priest, and ask him to make for them a god to lead them. It's not clear if the intent was to make it into a total god, but rather simply to serve as a replacement for Moshe. But in any case, it is seen as an act of idolatry. When Moshe comes down from the mountain and he's carrying the Aseret HaDibrot, the 2 tablets with the words of God on them, sees what he sees, he throws them down and breaks them, which sends a good lead into what we're going to talk about tonight. And then upbraids the people, destroys the golden calf, and turns back to God, seeking forgiveness for the people, and God finally acquiesces to forgive them. And Moshe asked to be able to see God. And God says, no one can see me and live. There's a limitation on the human ability to see the divine. And so it puts Moshe in a cleft in the side of the mountain, and as it were, puts his hand over Moshe's face, his eyes, and Moshe sees God's glory when it passes by him. And the famous words that we recite numerous times during the Yom Kippur service, and whenever we recite Slichot, Hashem Hashem Rachum v'Chanun Erech Apayim Rav Chesed v'Yemet Notzer Chesed L'Avim Noseyavam V'Fesha V'Chata Yinakeh. That God is forgiving and He forgives us for our sins. And the Midrash says that God shows Moshe that how he should recite these words. So God, as it were, puts himself in a talit, he wraps himself in a tallis as he recites these 13 articles of about God, and therefore, when we recite them, they're recited as a very important aspect of our seeking forgiveness from the divine. All right, and then Israel is forgiven, but somehow very early on, there is the fact that Israel did not observe as it should have, and that perhaps colors everything that is to happen to the Jewish people from then on. All right? Tonight, we're going to turn to mysticism. Right, last week was philosophy, and philosophy, as I shared with you, to the major part of most of the time, was an approach that was very rationalistic. Mysticism is a different kettle of fish. Mysticism is defined as the desire to achieve a direct experience of God. And the mystic sees the world as being more than what can be perceived with the physical senses. So right away, we see this divide between the more rational approach to the world around us to the mystical way of seeing the world. That for the mystic, not just what you experience with your eyes and your senses, but more than that exists within the world. Now, there's as far back as we know and can tell, there's always been a mystical element within the Jewish circles. The earliest expressions of mysticism were included very early works of the 1st and 2nd century of the Common Era. They're called Hechalot texts and Sefer HaYetzirah. These were introduced some of the terms and ideas that we're going to talk about later on. The existence of these texts, the fact that there was a mystical element within Jewish tradition, was not predominant up until the later Middle Ages. We know that there were people who studied these elements, but they usually were very small groups. It was a teacher and a student, or a couple of students at most. The Talmud warns about making public explanations of the Maaseh Merkavah, the chariot of God that is described in the opening chapters of the book of Ezekiel. We're not supposed to be preached on in public. One of the most important earlier Middle Age spokesmen for mysticism was Rabbi Moses ben Nachman, called the Ramban, N on the end, not M to be confused with Rambam, or Nachmanides. And his commentary on the Torah makes allusions to many esoteric meanings of the Torah, but he alludes to them, but he doesn't go into any great detail. But when we think of mysticism today, for the most part, the Jewish mysticism has become associated with what is known as Kabbalah. Now, the word Kabbalah simply means the received tradition, the received mystical knowledge. Maimonides had a form of Kabbalah. The idea was that he had received it from his teachers, and he transmitted it to the next generation. But when we talk about Kabbalah, we begin talking about a work called the Zohar. The Zohar, the Book of Splendor, is the central text of Kabbalistic tradition. It claims to have been written by Shimon Bar Yochai, one of the rabbis who was active in the 2nd century, the Common Era, and it's a commentary on the Torah like other midrashic works, but with very strong mystical bent. Also, instead of being written in Hebrew, it's written in Aramaic, for the most part. Now, most modern scholars, and even some of the ancient ones, assumed that it was compiled not by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but its reputed discoverer and popularizer, Rabbi Moshe de Leon, in the 14th century. So Moshe de Leon brings to the world the knowledge of this work, the Zohar. And he claims, well, the book itself claims to go back in time to Shimon ben Yochai Bar Yochai, who is mentioned in the Talmud as having a mystical streak and certain mystical stories surround him. But as I said, the moderns, in looking at it and find cues and clues that it was written, at least in part, at the time of Moshe de Leon. It doesn't mean it was wholly formed out of new cloth. Certainly many of the ideas and teachings that are found in the Zohar date back to earlier Jewish traditions. But it was not a work until the time of Moses de Leon. Now, according to the Zohar, Torah study can proceed along 4 levels of interpretation. And this is also known from rabbinic works as well. And these 4 levels are called pardes, because their initial letters spell out pardes, which means an orchard. but it's abbreviation for pshat, meaning simple, direct interpretation of the text. The simple, straightforward meaning of anything that you read in the Torah. Remez, the second of these, hints to the allegoric meanings through allusion. So that, for example, when Abraham is told to sacrifice Isaac, and he has to overcome his reluctance from serving God completely, and it comes as a paradigm for people in the future to obey the word of God. Drash, from the Hebrew darash, inquire or seek. This is a midrashic, rabbinic interpretation, often with comparisons with other passages in the Torah and similar words or verses. This is very common in the midrash. They make use of anomalous letters or words that are also found elsewhere, and that's a normative rabbinic practice. And the final part, the sod, is the secret, mystery, the inner esoteric metaphysical meanings expressed in Kabbalah. So you have pardes, peish, pshat, straightforward meaning, resh, remez, allusions, dalid, darash, and sod, the secret mystical interpretations, thus pardes. Now, for the followers of the mystical tradition, the Kabbalah is seen as a necessary part of the study of Torah. You can't learn Torah without really seeing the mystical, the sod aspects of the Torah. And this was not always accepted by all Jews. And it was opposed by some. Especially in the modern era, the rise of modernity and the greater impact of rational and scientific approaches, it was really looked down. The reform movements and more liberal elements in the Jewish world saw in Kabbalah some kind of benighted ancient superstition. It's fascinating to see how that has changed. There was a work called the Jewish Encyclopedia. The Jewish Encyclopedia was written in the beginning of the 20th century, and it was mostly written by European and some American scholars of the modern streams of Wissenschaft, and they really didn't take too much to Kabbalah, and it has a very short, relatively short passages discussing it. The Encyclopedia Judaica, which has now been reissued in a second version of it, which dates back to the 1970s, has 100 pages or more talking about Kabbalah and mysticism. And in recent years, with the rise of what is called neo-Hasidism, liberal movements within Judaism who have adopted certain ideas and concepts that are found within the Hasidic vision of the world and are interested in a more spiritual kind of approach to both understanding God and approaching God, has become very much more popular. And of course, it's very much part of the Hasidic movement, which indeed part of the reason the Hasidic movement was found disfavor among many in the Orthodox circles was because they were popularizing the Kabbalah, and these rabbinic figures thought that that was not proper, that it only should be something studied by people who had great knowledge of Jewish texts already. And so you may have heard you're not supposed to study Kabbalah until you're 40 years of age. And so they very much were opposed to it, but it is today become once again an important element both within certain circles in the Orthodox world and in the non-Orthodox world. So let's go back now to the 12th and 13th centuries. where we have this the Zohar and this mystical revival that takes place in the 16th century in the city of Tzfat. And after the Spanish expulsion in 1492, Jews are expelled from Spain. And they settle in different places throughout the world, in Amsterdam and parts of Eastern Europe, Greece, Turkey, and some make their way to the land of Israel. And there was a group of mystics that centered in the city of Tzfat, which had a reputation for a place of mystical experience. Amongst the members of that group was Isaac Luria, which we will talk about more. The main mystical figure was a man by the name of Moshe Cordovero. And of course, the author, Joseph Caro, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, was also in that circle. And one of the things that we owe to that circle was the creation of the Friday night part of the Friday night service, the Kabbalat Shabbat. And the mystical poem of Lecha Dodi was composed by one of the members of this group. Okay. So they studied together, and they transmitted what they had been taught one to the other. And this becomes the foundation for Kabbalah. Now, they said that the claim was made that the Kabbalah had been known and been part of Jewish tradition from the 10th century BCE, and it was practiced by over 1 million people in ancient Israel, although we have no historical evidence for this. But foreign conquest drove this Jewish spiritual leadership at the time to hide the knowledge and make it secret, fearing it might be misused or fell into the wrong hands. And that's why the Kabbalah became secretive, forbidden, and esoteric to Judaism. Torah Tasod, the hidden Torah, for 2.5 millennia. So now, as I said, one of the most important leaders of this circle in Tzfat was a man by the name of Moshe Cordovero. He wrote a work called Pardes Rimonim. Pardes, again, referring back we had before, the garden, the 4 different ways of interpreting the Torah. Rimonim is a pomegranate. And the pomegranate has numerous seeds in it, according to tradition, 613. And so his Pardes Rimonim was a description of Kabbalistic thought. He also wrote a work, an ethical tract called Tomer Devorah, but this is still important and very significant. His approach was not identical to the one of the most famous of the Kabbalists, Isaac Luria. Isaac Luria is often referred to as the Ari or the Arizal. The abbreviation Ari is Ashkenazi, because he was originally from Ashkenazic background. Rabbi Yitzchak Zal Zichrono Livracha, blessed memory. So you will see him referred to often as Arizal or the Arizal. And his Lurianic Kabbalah is what we're going to be talking about tonight for the most part. That's the one I have at least some familiarity with. And we will go with that. Now, Kabbalah, the Kabbalistic notion begins with creation. And one of the issues that confronted philosophy as well was, if the divine is infinite, how can the divine come into contact with the finite? And we know that Neoplatonism came up with the idea, and is adopted by the Kabbalah, with the idea of emanations. There's an emanation from the divine. God himself doesn't enter directly to the world, but an emanation. I was thinking about earlier, how could I describe it best? You think, you're sitting around a light, a lamp, and you see the light coming, You can experience the light, but there's nothing there that you can touch, nothing there that you can taste. Your eyes can see it. It emanates, as it were, from this source, the light source. So how does the world come into being? So there, first of all, has to take place what is called in the mystical tradition, tzimtzum, contraction. Now, this is used earlier by the rabbis of the Mishnaic period to say, how was it that God was to be found in the Mishkan, the tabernacle? Because God is everywhere. So he underwent a tzimtzum, a kind of a contraction, as it were, so that his presence could be in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle. It doesn't mean he was only there, but it means he contracted himself so that some kind of manifestation was there. Lurianic Kabbalah takes this concept of tzimtzum and turns it on its head. Instead of God contracting into one spot, God needs to create space for the universe to come into being. If everything is God, then how can you have a physical universe? So tzimtzum is a contraction, not God coming like this, but God opening a void like this. When the void is opened, it creates a space for the physical universe to come into existence. So God undergoes this tzimtzum. And into this tzimtzum, rays of light, as it were, emanate from the Ein Sof, the divine infinity. So it's imagine it this way. You've got a fish tank, and you want to put, you fill it with water, and you want to put one of those little castles inside your fish tank, but there's no room for it because it's all filled with water. And if you just drop it in, the water will spill out. So instead of the water spilling out, as it were, assume that all sides of the fish tank are infinite. And God creates a space, an air bubble, if you were, as it were, which creates the place for the universe to come into being. And then a bright light emanates from the Ein Sof. The Ein Sof is everything outside of the physical universe. And that light is the light of creation. But or God says, let there be light. And that act of creation is emanation from the divine, the Ein Sof, the without end, the infinite divinity that begins the act of creation. I point out, and I think it's interesting, that in a sense, that's what the Big Bang is that there's nothing, at least according to cosmologists today, and then the universe expands outward. This is the tzimtzum that God undergoes. And as it expands, the universe comes into being, and light comes into this void. I don't know if the cosmologists know anything about Lurianic Kabbalah, but I think there's an interesting parallel there. All right, so now, this emanation from God was supposed to be held. I'm going to constantly say, as it were. As it were means this is the best we can do to describe it. It doesn't mean this is the real description, but it's the best way we can say it. As it were, these rays of light, they come into the void, were supposed to be organized in a certain way, in the sense of what we call the sphirot, the 10 sphirot. Where is this? Second. Show caption, notes, whiteboard apps, share. Where's the share? Share screen. Okay. Thank you. I need that. All right. So this is the traditional rending, or one traditional rending of the Sphirot. And so the idea was that the light would emanate from the top, making its way down. But in the process, something goes wrong. And these vessels, these vessels that are referred to, kelim, break. It's too much. They can't hold it. And since they can't hold it, it begins a process that continues on, breaking through the other parts of the kelim, of the vessels. And as they break up these vessels, they form shards. And these shards, which are called in Hebrew klipot, these klipot then capture some of these rays of light, sparks of light, the tzitzot. And through the observance of mitzvot and mystical practices, the sparks of light which are hidden under the klipot can be redeemed and returned to God, to the way they were supposed to be. And the idea behind it is when Jews observe the mitzvot, they have great power. And that power brings down the upper worlds, and it takes and raises up these netzitzot above. On the other hand, when it goes wrong, we don't do what is right, more sparks can be captured. So it's a back and forth going on. Now, there's all kinds of relations and explanations of how these different sphirot interact with each other, and that's far above my grade level to understand. So I'm going to give you kind of an idea of what's going on, and I don't necessarily expect you to remember any of this because I don't always remember it. So we'll get back to our sphirot. So at the top, you have what is called keter. Oh, I didn't do that right, did I? Got to share it again. Okay, so at the top, we have keter. That's, I don't know, can you see that there? Keter means crown. The supernal crown, representing above conscious will. Next, if you go to the left of keter, you have chokhmah. Chokhmah is wisdom. Across from chokhmah is bina, understanding. Now, the two elements, chokhmah and bina, have to balance each other to a certain extent. Just like when we go down to the next level, you have chesed, loving kindness, grace, and across from it is gvura, might, which in some ways is the aspect of justice. So you have to have a combination, a relationship of chesed to gvura. They have to relate to each other. And then tiferet, also called mercy, rachamim, The next you have Netzach, victory, eternity, Hod, glory. Then we start narrowing back down again to Yesod. And finally, Malchut, which is just above or just touches upon the world in which we inhabit, the physical world. And when you read Kabbalistic works, they suggest that there's a series of worlds leading one to the other, and the bottom of one is the top of the previous one, as it were. And so it goes down and down and down until it reaches the world in which we inhabit. Now, this imagery is also referred to sometimes as Adam Harishon or Adam Kadmon, primordial man. It's said to be representative of the human being. Had Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, observed the mitzvot, the one mitzvah they had, not to eat of the tree of knowledge, then the world would have been put right. But it didn't happen that way. Instead, we live in the world in which we live in which the world of klipot, of struggle to find the right way. You know, this imagery of the Sfirot is also related by Kabbalistic ideas to the human soul is somehow contained within the Sfirot. And what is also clear for the Kabbalists, that there is both male and female aspects to the divine. Doesn't mean they are separate gods, but it means they're male and female attributes or aspects of that which is divine. And as a matter of fact, the last of the Sfirot, which is also sometimes called Shekhinah, is said to be the divine presence, the female divine presence. Now let's step back for a second. This is a very important element of Lurianic Kabbalah, the Kabbalah that was created in Sfat. These were, this is in the 16th century. These were the descendants or people themselves who had experienced the expulsion from Spain. They saw in that expulsion a separation from the life they had had. And based on other rabbinic teachings, they speak of the divine as I said, with male and female elements. So, for example, we say the Shekhinah, that which you sense, you feel, when you feel the divine really there with you, that's feminine. And Adonai, the Lord, the God, is a more masculine. And somehow, as a result of all these catastrophes, those two elements have been separated in a kind of galut themselves, in a sense of exile. And one of the things that we try to do is to bring those two elements back together. That's why the Kabbalists created special introductory words to recite before performance of the mitzvot. And those introductory words will have within them the Shem Yichud, for the sake of the reunification of the divine, Yud He Vav He, together. So by having this in mind, when you are about to perform a mitzvah, you turn it into a mystical act, not only the physical, whatever it is, directly of the mitzvah that you're performing, but also into part of the process of redemption. And, that's a very powerful idea. And if you think of it that way, that every time you do a mitzvah, you're helping to redeem the entire universe, it makes a lot more involvement in terms of your relationship to that mitzvah. So as I said, now there are various ways of looking at the Sfirot. Divine creation by means of the 10 Sfirot, according to one approach, is an ethical process. And they represent the different aspects of morality. Loving kindness, as I said, is a possible moral justification found in Chesed, and Gevurah is a moral justification of justice. And they both are mediated by mercy, which is Rachamim. So you have the different poles, and they come together to create the proper balance in the world in which we live. These pillars of morality can become immoral once they become extremes. When loving kindness becomes extreme, it can lead to sexual impropriety. Whoops, page missing. Sorry about that. And lack of justice can lead to wickedness. But when justice becomes extreme, it can lead to torture and the murder of the innocent and unfair punishment. So you have to have this balance between them in a ethical world. And I think that's part of what makes it popular amongst some, quote, neo-Hasidic movements in today's world, in which they interpret their understanding of Tikkun Olam as the proper balancing of these things into the world today through social justice. Now, as far as the human soul itself in Kabbalah, the Kabbalistic system posits that the human soul has three elements: the nefesh, the ruach, and the neshama. Nefesh is found in all humans and enters the physical body at birth. It's the source of one's physical and psychological nature. The next two parts of the soul are not implanted at birth, but can be developed over time. And their development depends upon the actions and beliefs of the individual, and are said to fully exist in people who are only in people who have been awakened spiritually. So a common way of explaining these three elements is nefesh is the lower or animal part of the soul, linked to instincts and bodily cravings. Perhaps one would say this is a Freudian id. Ruach, the middle soul, the spirit, it contains the moral virtues and the ability to distinguish between good and evil. And the neshama, the higher soul or super soul. You can look at it in some ways as id, ego, and superego in Freudian terms. And this super soul, this neshama, separates human beings from other life forms. It's related to the intellect. It allows a human being to enjoy and benefit from the Olam Haba, the world to come. And this part of the soul is provided in birth and allows one to have some awareness of the existence and presence of God. There are other aspects that may be found there as well. We will skip over all of that. Amongst those other souls that one can have is the idea that we say that on Shabbat, you have the neshama yetera, the supplemental soul that a Jew experiences on Shabbat and makes for the enhanced spiritual enjoyment of the day. It exists only when one is observing Shabbat. It can be lost and gained depending on one's observance, and it disappears at Motzei Shabbat when the Sabbath ends. Neshama Kadosha provided to Jews at the age of maturity, the holy souls related to the study and fulfillment of the Torah commandments. It exists only when one studies and follows Torah. It can be lost and gained depending on one's study and observance. So the Kabbalistic vision, it can be divided in two ways, I think. You have what I've mostly been discussing so far, which is a very complex relationship of different elements and their interactions one with the other. And that's in the world, in the realm of the experts, the knowledgeable ones. But then you have the aspect of the Kabbalistic notion in which the human being has the capacity to affect not just the world around, but even the divine realm. It posits that we can influence even the divine. You know, one of the challenges for the philosopher is if God is above and beyond the world, God cannot change. God cannot be affected. And the Kabbalistic notion is not like that. It is, yes, we can affect God in a certain way. Our actions, our prayers especially, indeed have an effect upon the divine. And so when we pray in the proper way, when we observe in the proper manner, we not only help ourselves, but in some ways we help God himself. And I was reading not long ago in a later Kabbalistic work in which, in a sense, the author says, well, God is God and king unless he has those who accept his rule, it's meaningless. So God, in a sense, becomes king only when we make him our king. If we don't make him our king, it's as if he's a king without a country, without a population. And so through our actions, we make God into a king. Through our prayers, we can influence God's mercy. And it can go in different ways. And one of the things that can go to one extreme is that, you know, this world is meaningless except for the divine. And everything we do is really supplemental. It's only when God wants it, or we influence God to want it in some way, it comes to being. But our own actions are meaningless. It's one of the issues that is troubling today in the land of Israel, the state of Israel. Those who want to say that the very pious, the ones who spend all day learning in the yeshiva, they're the ones who are really bringing victory on the battlefield. The soldiers are merely the instruments of God's divine will, not that they are doing anything in and on their own. And therefore, it's more important for them to sit and study than to be out on the battlefield and serving in the army. While others would say, well, that's one thing, you know, not to deny that there is that power, but that's a power that exists for those who are devoted full time in a certain level, which most of these yeshiva bachers are not. And they can be of help serving like others do in the army. That gets tied in with some of these visions of what is the reality around the world. Okay, that's just kind of a taste on the mystical world. I don't claim to have any great knowledge of it. I share with you because it's part of the curriculum. But it does answer one of the things that the philosophers cannot. The philosophers can tell you about God, but they can't really tell you how to feel God. The Kabbalistic notion is to feel God, to unite with God. The role of the mystic often sees that they want to in some way have a connection with the divine, and they do it through some of the mystical practices that are also found within the Kabbalistic circles. And the rationale for the performance of mitzvot becomes, in the mystic's vision, universal power which the philosophers cannot offer. That's part of the reason, perhaps, why the Middle Ages and up until the modern era, the Kabbalistic approach was dominant. Okay, anybody have any questions? I'm sure I have plenty of questions I can't answer, but anything anybody wants to ask or add? All right. I wasn't sure what it was going to be like tonight, and that's why we're doing this on Zoom. We're doing it on Zoom, so I'm going to let you get off early tonight. So I'll say good night to everyone and see you next week, God willing, in person. Okay?
Oh, okay.
All righty. Good night.
Good night.
Thanks.
Laila.